So we were discussing something called a netia lechet, which means that in the root of a person's psyche, he may have already some sort of a propensity, a push, or a natural inclination towards a certain kind of a bad midah. And that's called shoresh. Shoresh meaning in the root. And Reb Chaim develops the idea that sometimes in a case of someone who has an Netiya Lechet, rather than that becoming a reality over the course of time, God might even take his soul and he'll die prematurely before he will sin. But in the case of a tzaddik gamur, who doesn't have a Netiya Lechet, then the tzaddik is on his own. God is not going to interfere, and we'll see what happens with him. There was a case of Yochanan Cohen Gadol, if you recall, that he served in the highest capacity as Cohen Gadol for 80 years. And apparently he didn't have that Netiya Lechet, but something new from the outside, got a hold of him. And you may recall that at the end of our Parsha, this week's Parshas Emor, the Torah tells us about a Ben Ish Mitzri. And the reason why this person, whose father was a Mitzri, fell to the lowest level, such a madrega shvela that you can't even imagine how could he have reached such a thing. It's because he already had in his shoresh a netiya lechet, and that came from the fact that his father was a Mitzri. And why does the Torah emphasize that his father was a Mitzri? Because already in the genes, so to speak, of Mitzrayim, there's a certain kind of an attitude towards God, like, who is he? I never saw him. I never had an experience with him. There are other gods and I can worship them. So now Reb Chaim on the bottom of page Reish Tzadi Hey says the following. Baruch Lakol, it's quite clear to everyone, Maven who understands, Shenetiya Zu, if you excuse me, if you have that netiya in you, that inclination, that little bud, Kashem Od Lashuv, you have a great challenge in overcoming that netiya, in subduing it. Shrei ha'adam v'atzmo pa'amim she'eno yodea mimena. It's so deep within his soul that he's not even aware of it himself. Hachote sheba lachzor b'tshuva, but nevertheless God gives man the freedom of doing tshuva, and biyado lakar sachet miikaro. A person has an unbelievable capacity and potential to eradicate, to undermine, and uproot that root that's evil. U'lisharesh acher hanetiya lechet, and to substitute, instead of that inclination, that drive towards sin, to have a drive towards good. So man has an amazing potential, the way God created him, to transform a netiya lechet, that pull towards sin, to a pull towards good things. V'reu chayav lasos came, and God obligates us in this responsibility. We can't just lay back and say, well, this is the way God created me. I have this tremendous netiya lechet. I have a desire to disrespect others. I have an inclination towards aggressive behavior or towards conceit and believing that I'm the end of the world, and I can't change that. A lot of people believe I can't change. Change is beyond me. The cynics will say, this is the way you were born. and there's nothing you could do about it. But the Torah and HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us an ability to do tshuva, even to overcome a netiyah lechet, which is deep within our souls. And the Rambam tells us an amazing thing in Hilchas Tshuva, that we can do tshuva to the extent, imagine how profound tshuva could be, what level it could reach. Sheviyoid olav yodea talumos, shelo yoshiv lezeh liolam. That the Almighty could testify that because this man did tshuva, he will never repeat that sin. Sheyoid olav HaKadosh Baruch Hu she'akar, akar means to uproot, shorshe achet mikol v'chol. I think you should underline that word she'akar, if you don't mind. She'akar es shorch she'achet. So what does the word she'akar mean? To be oker something, to uproot it, take it out from its roots, so that it'll never bother you, it'll never exist. And now we turn to the next page, which is Reish Tzadi Vav. And he summarizes everything he said until this point in the top paragraph. And he says, Shoresh Katan Shel Chet, there's a very subtle root of Chet, of sin. Tamun v'chavui bi omek libo shel adam. And it's deep down, below layers and layers. It's hidden in the psyche of man. Hareu shoresh pora rosh v'lana. You remember that we mentioned in the past something called lana. I think it's called wormwood or something like that. It's a very bitter and dangerous kind of an herb that grows in the ground, and it's so dangerous because of its shoresh, because of the roots. The roots underground of this kind of a plant are already toxic. It's just a matter of it growing. Umosif aholech. And it, excuse me, it continues to grow and develop over the course of time until it becomes, like a gigantic tree. And this shoresh, listen to what Reb Chaim says, this root, this rotten root that's deep below the surface of a person's soul, over min ha'av leben. It's passed genetically through the spiritual DNA from a father to a son, lidore doros, for generations upon generations. So this could possibly explain the challenge of gerim, of those who convert, because the shoresh comes from perhaps idolatry, and how challenging it is for a ger, a convert, to overcome and uproot those roots. That's why, by the way, we don't encourage gerim. We don't try to missionize people and get them to join the Jewish people. We expect that a ger would be self-motivated in order to achieve this tremendously difficult goal of uprooting that shoresh pore rosh vilana that passed down through the generations. That even something that has never really manifested itself and never appeared on the surface, but down the line, generations down the line, all of a sudden we see that this kind of inclination to evil all of a sudden shows up in a powerful way, and we ask, where did it come from? But we don't realize that it may have come from generations earlier. And he quotes the Ramban. The Ramban, at the end of the Torah, in Parshas Nitzavim, says the following. God turns to the Jewish people who are nitzavim ayom kulchem. Everyone is there, present as a kahal, as a community. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, wait a minute, is there somebody amongst us who has a shoresh pore rosh velana? Says the Ramban, pen, lest, yesh bachem shoresh ra, some root that's evil, sheyifre v'yiske, that will multiply and develop and become, so to speak, fruitful, but in a negative way. Ubiyomim aboim, and down the line, yotze prochim roim, he will produce very bad plants. V'yatzmiach merurus, that will have certain bitterness to them. They'll be toxic. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, Eis asher einenu po hayom, even someone who's not here with us today, but will be born generations down the line, says the Ramban, ki ha'av shoresh. The father, meaning the generation of Moshe Rabbeinu of fathers, are the shoresh. They have the roots. Va'ben, and the children, says the Ramban, are netzer misharsh of Yifra. They are the produce of those seeds that were planted. And in the seed, there's some netia l'ra. And now Reb Chaim quotes a medrash that speaks about the Bnos Moab. You remember that in the aftermath of the fiasco of Bilam in Parshas Balak, Bilam gives Balak and Moab an eitzah to send the girls out to entice the Jewish men. Send the Bnos Moab. So the Medrash says, how is it that in the Bnos Moab, and there was a massive number of them, they had the ability to do such a heinous thing, to seduce the men? The Gemara tells us exactly how they did it. You know, they had an older woman outside the tent and a younger woman inside the tent. It was a whole setup. Says the Medrash, it all goes back to the mother of Moab, the original mother of Moab. Who is the original Moab mother? It was the Bnos Lot, the daughters of Lot. Vatomer abchira latzeira. The older sister says to her younger sister, let's get our father drunk, Lot. Lecha v'nashkes avinu yayin. And that older daughter was the mother of Moab. So generations down the line, the Bnos Moab, who had within them that little subtle seed or inclination for harlotry, now it developed. And now it came to fruition and enabled the Bnos Moab to do this low kind of immoral act. And that's why the pasuk says, "Vayachal ha'am liznos es Bnos Moab." Says Reb Chaim, I don't understand. Were the Bnos Lot guilty of something? Were they evil when they wanted to propagate the world, when they believed that there was nothing left after the destruction of stone? The Gemara tells us in Nazir, Daf Chav Gimel Amid Beis, regarding the Maisa Bnos Lot, that it was a mitzvah. What they did was a mitzvah. And the Gemara says that the reason why David HaMelech, who came from Rus, who came from Moab, was because she, the original mother of Moab, did this mitzvah. She was the one who took the initiative and convinced her younger sister that this is what we have to do.
A person?
Yeah?
I thought one of the main problems was that she was so proud um, that she had slept with her father.
Not sure about that. There may be different views. I don't know which medrash you're quoting, but this medrash says that she did a mitzvah and she really wanted l'shem shamayim, so to speak. She had the right intention to save the world. So Reb Chaim asks, according to this Gemara in Nazir, why do we say that the shoresh, the root of the Bnos Moav, and their inclination towards, sexual licentiousness, why are we blaming the mother of Moav when she did a mitzvah at the time of Lot? And not only that, the Gemara quotes a pasuk, Ki yesharim darkei Hashem v'tzadikim yelchu ba. What is the tzaddikim yelchu ba? That the tzaddikim go in the derech of Hashem. Mashal, I'll give you an example of Lot ushtei benosav. Hem niskavnu l'shem mitzvah. Tzaddikim yelchu ba. Their intention was for the mitzvah. And therefore, Rus HaMoaviyah would come out of the Bnos Moav. Hushin is kaving l'shem avera, but Lot himself, he was having pleasure from this, even though he was in a state of drunkenness, and therefore poshim yikoshlu ba. So Reb Chaim wants to develop a very profound idea here in the paragraph that starts uleamar yesh lomar. According to everything that we've said, the af ki omnam niskavnu b'nos lov b'nos lot l'shem shamayim, even though the b'nos lot had the right intentions and therefore it's considered for them a mitzvah. Af al pichen, and here you have to underline the next words. I hope everyone has the place. Af al pichen besoch tocham, somehow deep down in their hearts, hoisa kayemes netia kalashel znus. They had some sort of subtle desire for this kind of a sexual relationship. Even though it was a very subtle, small root, because primarily they were motivated l'shem shamayim, and that's why it's called Ki Yesharim Darkei Hashem Tzadikim Yelchu Ba. Afal Piche, nevertheless, that little shoresh, that little netia towards znus, was passed on through the generations until finally it expressed itself in the case of the Bnos Moav, who enticed the men of Israel to have these perverted sexual relationships. And Tchilas Iburo Shel Moav L'Hoyel El L'Shem Znus. In other words, even though the beginning was for a good purpose, but nevertheless, underneath it all, below the surface, perhaps even they were unaware of it, there was a desire on their part to have this terrible, sexual action of having a relationship with their own father. And now he says, on page Reish Tzadi Zayin, we're looking at the paragraph about 5 lines down from the top. Ubazem uvanim divrei baliatosis shagorem. What caused the giduf, the cursing of God? Hashmashahaya ben ish mitzri, because his father was a mitzri. V'darkom shel mitzrayim levazos es Hashem. What does it mean? After all, as we asked yesterday, Paro was totally immersed and dedicated to idolatry, you wouldn't expect anything else than him saying, well, who is God? But hakavana, what the Balei Atosos have in mind, is hashoresh l'maiseh shel giduf, the root of the crime of blasphemy. Hoya etzel avosav hamitzrayim. You could find it and trace it back to his father's father, who was a Mitzri. K'mosha Amar Paro, just like Paro said, Lo yadati es Hashem, I don't know who God is. Shoresh zeh, that root which was ingrained in Mitzrayim, is a pore rosh velana. V'godel, that seed developed until finally this, I don't know what generation, maybe it's fifth generation of the Mitzrayim. Finally, it developed into Giduf, because already in the Shoresh, there was a rotten seed and an inclination towards denying God. He says, Biofen Acher. Okay, that I think will what I'd like to do now, because our time is limited, if it's okay with you, to turn backwards to page Reish Pei Zayin. Now, just by way of introduction, we've seen over and over again how Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, in his approach to Mussar, very often focuses on one particular attribute and how it could impact on a person's life. For example, you may remember that we spoke about preparing for Kabbalas HaTorah. And one of the major preparations for Kabbalas HaTorah is hisatzmus v'chazkus l'limud HaTorah, to garnish and gather up energy and dedicate that energy to the study of Torah. So that's a positive midah, obviously. But on the other side, the other extreme, there's a very dangerous, bad midah called atzlus. What's the translation of atzlus?
Laziness.
Laziness, yes, laziness. Now, the pasuk tells us in this week's parsha, Parshas Emor, that there's someone who's worthy in every generation to be appointed as the Kohen Gadol. And why is he called the Kohen Gadol? And why is he selected? Because he has 5 different attributes. He's Gadol b'chachma, and he's Gadol b'koach. Now, let's just focus on this concept called koach, Gadol b'koach. What does it mean? Well, who could tell me and prove to me that Aaron was such a strong guy that he got the appointment of being the Kohen Gadol? Who can prove that to me? So the Medrash says, I'll prove it to you. Because he did what's called the Tnufa of the Levium. What does it mean? You had to pick up the Nevi'im. And this was all done and accomplished in one day by Aaron HaKohen. And how many Levium did he have to lift up? 22,000 Levium. And what did he have to do? He had to lift them up and shake them and put them down. And this teaches us that Aaron was very, very powerful. So Reb Chaim wants to understand, why is it so important that the Kohen Gadol be powerful? Okay, it's a great thing to be strong. That's what the Navi says, Al Yishalel HaGibar B'Gvuraso. Don't lord it over to others and think you're great because you're so powerful, you're so strong. It must be that strength is a good thing. But why does the Kohen Gadol have to be strong? And not only that, a Navi, a prophet, has to be strong. Because the Gemara tells us in Masechta Nedarim, Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mashra Shechinaso El Al Gibar, that one of the qualifications, the preconditions to reach the level of Nevuah, you have to be a Gibar. And the Rambam writes in the 7th chapter of Yesodei HaTorah, Ein HaNevuah Chala Ela Al Chacham Gadol B'Chachma Gibar B'Midosav. So it seems that the Rambam has a new interpretation of Gibar. Gibar doesn't mean that he could lift, a ton of weights in the physical world, but rather he's a Gibar B'Midosav. What does that mean, a Gibar B'Midosav? Says the Rambam, Lo Yitzro Misgaber. His Yetzer Hara will not get the better of him. He always can defeat the Yetzer Hara. So it means that according to the Rambam, the word Gibar doesn't mean physical strength, but rather Gibar B'Midosav. And the Mishnah says in the 4th chapter of Avos, which is I think the chapter we're reading this Shabbos, if you have that minute, is Ezu Gibar HaKovesh Es Yitzro. What do you mean Ezu Gibar? I'll tell you Ezu Gibar, he can lift 1,000 pounds. No, HaKovesh Es Yitzro. He can overcome his Yetzer Hara. So Reb Chaim says, I want to give you a definition of a Gibar. What is a Gibar? I mean, Chazal say that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Gibar. He's able to carry the Luchos all the way down the mountain. And the Luchos were very heavy. So here we're turning to page Reish Pei Chet. Says Reb Chaim, an unbelievable chiddush here. What is a Gibar? A Gibar is someone who overcomes the midah of atzlus, of laziness. He says that the midah of laziness is such a destructive midah when a person can't get the energy to accomplish what he has to accomplish. Shlomo Melech in Mishlei declares that he once passed a vineyard that was owned by an ish atzel, by a lazy person. And he describes what happens to the vines. Hine ola kulo kamshonim, kisu panav. The grapes were not growing properly because the owner of the vineyard was lazy. Says Shlomo Melech, the root of laziness could be the root of destruction. He describes Shlomo Melech, the atzel, the person who's lazy, as chaser leiv. What does that mean, chaser leiv? He doesn't think and pay attention to the responsibility to reach to achieve a goal. If he would pay more attention and realize that there's a tremendous goal here, a purpose, and he could achieve that goal, then he would overcome his laziness. But he doesn't pay attention. He would rather take it easy in life, laid back. I have enough, I'm complacent, I don't have to go beyond that. And that's called chaser leiv. He doesn't even realize that the result of his laziness is going to lead to destruction when the vineyard is going to be all disintegrated. So it's not enough to see what's going on around you. You have to pay attention to it. You have to put your mind to it. You have to understand. Moshe Rabbeinu goes out of the palace, and Vayaris Achiv, and he saw Vayar B'Sivlosam. It doesn't just mean that he saw the Jewish people, the slaves, suffering, but rather he felt it. He identified with it. What we call empathize with it. So therefore, Ra'isi, when you see something, the question now is, will you take it to heart? Lakachti Mussar. If you pay attention to it, then you'll get the Mussar, you'll get the moral challenge and the moral ability to make those decisions, the right decisions, to motivate yourself to overcome laziness. Somebody once said that sleeping is a kind of suicide because when you sleep too long, you kill so much time that you could have used for productivity. And he says that Lo toil hakarasa shalom mafilu hakara b'mida gedola kolzman shel yosem esdvarim al libo. Until you pay absolute attention, until you contemplate and let it sink in what you could accomplish now. What if you set your goals and you motivate yourself? He says the following. If you remember, there was one of the 10 makas was barad, which destroyed anything that was out there in the fields. And the Torah describes the situation where some of the Avdei Paro, who knew they were forewarned about makas barad, and they had to take all of their mikneh, their animals, inside to protect them from the makkah, and yet the pasuk says, "Asher lo som libo." They didn't pay attention. They didn't focus. El Dvar Hashem, to the warning that they got from God. Vayazov, and they left things out there in the field, and everything was destroyed. Harei kol mitzrim kfar ro beineim ki divrei Moshe emes. They had seen makkah after makkah every time anything that Moshe warned them about came to fruition. V'chol makkah asher hodiu oleh Moshe ba alehem kasher diber. Moshe never lied to them. Everything that he promised came to fruition. V'ech zeh, how is it possible? Shesh iru es avdeim mikneim basodeh. Why did they do something so stupid? Didn't they realize what was going to happen? Moshe already warned them. He was good for his word over and over again. And the pasuk says, "Asher lo sam el libo," that they didn't focus, they didn't pay attention, they didn't take it into heart. So Reb Chaim Shulevitz says that an otzel who's lazy and kills great opportunities to achieve, it's all because lo sam lev. He refuses to focus his attention, contemplate, and be inspired to assimilate and integrate into his heart the goals that he could achieve. Instead, he wants to take life easy. And now we're on page Reish Pei Tes. And we'll finish up Mirza Shem in just a few minutes. He says, Darko shala'atzel lahatzdik es hatzluso. It's not enough that a person is idle, laid back, sits on the sidelines, rests outside in the hammock, goes from one couch to a chair, and he's just too lazy. But not only that, says Reb Chaim, he justifies it. He says, he declares that the malach is l'mala mikochosai. I can't do it. He beats himself down and denies that he can do it. When I was reading books to my children as I was raising them, maybe you remember this book, The Engine That Could. Do you remember that book?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We used to get it in on a cloth, So what's the engine that could? The engine that realizes what his potential is But the Otzel is not willing to put his shoulder to the task, and he justifies it by saying, "I can't do it. I can't," until he finally convinces himself that he can't do it. He says what a person has to say to himself is sheker atadover. He's got to look the Yetzer Hara in the eyes and say, "You're a no good liar." In Meleches HaMishkan, building the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the Torah testifies, "Vayavo kol ish asher niso libo." When Moshe Rabbeinu let out a clarion call, who could possibly help us and create the utensils and build the Mishkan? Who came forward? Kol ish asher niso libo. His heart prompted him. Says the Ramban, Lo hoya ben mishalom es hamlochos halolu. There wasn't one single Jew in the entire community of Israel coming out of Mitzrayim who was proficient and experienced and apprenticed to learn these malachos. They didn't have a malamed, they had no one to teach them. Aval b'matza b'tivo, but they looked into their hearts and they said, "Vayigba liba b'darkei Hashem." This is what I have to do. This is what I have to accomplish. I'm going to do this. And I just want to add, and you know it better than I do, that on October 7th, there were people, chayalim, chayalot, and even just regular rank and file members of the community that went out there to save lives. Many times they didn't even know how to do it. So these were the Chachmei Lev who built the Mishkan. And somehow were able to achieve this. So, before we were having trouble finding a laptop. And we were about to give up hope. So I suggested asking this rabbi, asking this rabbi. I sent a whole list to Chaim, 4 or 5 rabbis. I said, wait a minute. I'm not gonna be lazy. I'm gonna do this myself. So I looked at my phone and I had a number for Avnoach, Nirenberg. So I called him up. Now, what were the chances that he would even bother answering the phone at 4 p.m. in the afternoon when he's steiging away in the base medrash? I don't have to tell you what a masmidi is. And yet he immediately identified who was calling him. He answered the phone. Within 5 minutes, less than that, we had a laptop. So it means you got to believe that you can do it. And Reb Chaim, if you recall, one of my favorite shmuzim of this entire book, called Yichud Alev. You remember Yichud Alev? Do you remember how Yaakov Avinu was able to lift that stone off the Pia Be'er, off the well? Was Yaakov Avinu, says Reb Chaim, such a powerful guy? But Yichud Alev. So he says the following, that when it comes to Cheftzei Shomayim, when we realize that we are here on this earth as divine agents, Hamutolim ala Adam, and there's a responsibility on our shoulders, let's not be lazy. Let's not try to convince ourselves, oh, I can't do it. I don't have the training. I don't have the proficiency. I don't have the strength. I can't do it. This is, on a moral level, the constant battle that we are facing. Because it's so easy to lay back and say, let somebody else do it. I remember I once attended a shmooze from Rav Chagai Raviv. Are you familiar with that name at all? Yeah. So Rav Chagai was talking about the fact that in some Parshas in the Torah, God speaks to the entire klal, but in other Parshios, in like the Aseret Adibros, God speaks b'lashon yachid. He addresses every single individual. So Rav Chagai said, and I thought it was a beautiful insight, that sometimes if God would only use the plural, then each individual would say, well, the whole community is obligated. I'm not obligated. Let somebody else take care of it. And it's so easy to pass the baton and say, well, let somebody else take care of it. And that's also an expression and a development of the midah of atzlus. Why me? I can't do it. Let somebody else do it. So let's just, in closing, combine the two messages and integrate them from Parshas Emor according to Reb Chaim. The first message is that sometimes we have within ourselves, each and every one of us, a netiyah l'chet. And it may have been developed generations earlier and passed down through the spiritual DNA. And our obligation, our responsibility is to try to uproot those netiyos l'chetos midos, as small and as subtle as they may seem, and yet Hashem promises we can do tshuva. So we have to believe in ourselves. Combine that with the choice of the Kohen Gadol, because he's a gibar, and to undermine atzlus, and to say, yes, we can live up to the challenge. We can utilize all our energy, garnish our energy with a yichud alev, vayigba liva b'darkei Hashem, like the Osei HaMalacha with a chachmei lev. And if we're lazy, chas v'shalom, then look what could be the results when we miss opportunities. See, Ratzon, let's be hopeful and prayerful to Hashem that He'll give us this strength to overcome laziness, to think and contemplate what we can accomplish, set our goals, never say we can't do it, and realize that it's our responsibility, each and every one of us, to undermine and uproot those netios, and in so doing, Emir Hashem will be successful, as Ovdei Hashem will be ready as we move forward to the end of the Sphira after the tonight's Sphira. I don't want to mention which day it is, but you know what I have in mind, and will be projected towards Kabbalah Satorah and Chag HaShavuos. Ken Yiratzon. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you
bro.
so much. Wishing everyone a great Shabbos.
Have a
Thank
nice
you,
Shabbos.
brother. Mazel tov, mazel tov.
Thank you so much. I'll be the Sandik tomorrow, Mir Hashem.
Oh, wow. Thanks,